Greetings and peace, everybody. I have the honor and privilege of having Sheikh Wahid Azal of the Fatimiyya Sufi order back for part three. So part ones and twos got such a great response, and I thank all of you who have given me such a positive feedback on this journey that we're on together in terms of love, light, bringing light to the human family, and our basically our fight against the agents of chaos and darkness. And now for part three, I would like Sheikh Wahid Azal to explain everything that he would like to in terms of this cult that we're fighting against, like these different cults of the New World Order. And basically his voice and his background has been very suppressed by the enemy. He's been targeted in many ways. And that this is where we come in as the human family, myself included, to give him that platform and to support him in his endeavors. So without further ado, I give Nur alaikum to Sheikh Wahid Azal and just hand over the floor to him.
Wa alaikum Nur as-salam. In the name of God, the most revocatedly alive, the supreme discloser. This is a very important topic. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation throughout the conspiracy culture on many different facets of this question, and the groups involved, and what it is and what it isn't, and whether there is such an organization as the Illuminati, whether there isn't. For the record, I don't believe that there is any kind of an overarching organization that is omnipotent on this planet that can, manipulate everything. Of course, there have been individuals, there have been powers, there have been interests throughout history that have done so. One could use the generic term, the Black Lodge, for this. So such a thing, I think, kind of very loosely as a shorthand, we can say it exists. Now, my personal experience and also family experience with one of the very central cults of the New World Order, or the way I have relabeled this whole term, the neoliberal world order, are the Baha'is. And I'm mainly talking about the main parent organization known as the Baha'i organization. My family came out of this organization. I was born into this organization, and I tend to kind of contextualize my own experience with the Baha'is in a very similar light as how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born amongst the pagan idol worshippers in Mecca, and out of them came the Muwahid, the ultimate Muwahid, the Unitarian of the age. So I look at it from that perspective. My family's own pedigree is a very interesting one. On one side of our family, on my father's side, they are associated with the Sheikh school, particularly its Kermani branch, and the hereditary leaders of that school, the Ibrahimis, who began with the notable figure of Haj Muhammad Karim Khan Kermani. On my mother's side, there's a mixed pedigree, but on my mother's father's side, we have one line that goes back to the Baraghani family of Qazvin. And these were eminent scholar families, 12 Shiite from the 18th and 19th century, and predominantly one particular figure in this family line was the woman known to posterity as Qurratul Ayn, the solace of the eyes. She was a major disciple of Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirazi the Bab, one of considered the greatest heresiarch of the 19th century, 12 Shia Muslim, who I consider to be one of the greatest Gnostic whoever and mystics that has ever walked the earth, at least in the Ummah of Islam, and which the Fatimiyya Sufi order itself traces a pedigree. Now, given the misinformation that this Baha'i cult has propagated for over 100-something odd years, usually most people subsume the earlier Babi movement or the Bayanis with the Baha'is. And I'm here to tell you that nothing can be further from the truth. The Bayanis, the people, the group, the community that emerged from the teachings of Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirazi the Bab, had a head, a successor to the Bab by the name of Mirza Yahya Nuri Sofa Azal, the dawn of pre-eternity. He was nominated in writing by the Bab before his execution on July 8th, 1850. But he had an older brother, Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri, known to posterity as Baha'u'llah, the splendor of God. And there's a reason why he got this title that I can actually explain in a minute. And over a course of about less than 19 years after the execution of the Bab in Tabriz, the older brother proceeded to basically usurp the entire movement and redirect it into a different direction altogether. A lot of research that is coming from people like my friend Sayyid Miqdad Nabavi, Razavi in Iran and others is proving with documentation and valid historiography that in the 1850s, this older brother Baha'u'llah was actually approached by two very notable agents of the British Empire who also had a very central role to play in the history of Freemasonry in the Middle East.
All right.
Of course, the British Rite of Freemasonry, one of whom was a Parsi agent and Grand Master of the British Rite of Freemasonry of Bombay by the name of Menakji Limji Hataria. He was a very notable figure in Bombay and became a very close figure within the British imperial apparatus of India and the subcontinent. And then subsequently, he was sent to Iran to try to organize, actually modernize the Zoroastrian community of Iran, but ended up leaving it quite a mess in his wake with the Zoroastrians there. So the Zoroastrians in Iran have a very mixed memory of Menakji and also his successors after that. The second figure is a very interesting figure because he was initially an ambassador by the Qajar court, the ruling dynasty of the time. And this was Mirza Malcolm Khan. And Mirza Malcolm Khan had a very interesting career. He was basically in contact with all of the various movers and shakers within the Middle East during the 19th century. People like Sayyid Jamaluddin Asadabadi, known as Al-Afghani, was in contact with him. And Mirza Malcolm Khan actually founded the very first homegrown Masonic order in Iran, known as the Faramush Khaneh, the House of Forgetfulness. This was his own kind of thing that was spawned out of the British Rite of Freemasonry. He initially was with the Qajars as a government, obviously as the ambassador, as a government employee, but over time broke with the Qajars, and over time, as we know, as the documentation showed, became a very active agent of British imperial interest throughout the Middle East. And these two, in the 1850s, went to Baghdad, where the Babis, or the Babi leadership was located at the time, and made direct contact with Baha'u'llah. And it appears that during this time when this contact was made, that the major split within the Babi community occurs. And this is the point where then, after the Babis are expelled by the Ottoman authorities from Baghdad to Ottoman Turkey, first to Istanbul, and then later on the Black Sea coast of Edirne, this convergence and this contact between these two British agents and Baha'u'llah was the reason why the split happened, and also why then the Baha'is began to expand. And the Babis, the earlier Babis, are known to posterity as the Azali Babis or the Bayanis, became more and more marginalized. Their numbers became fewer and fewer. There were murders on the part of the Baha'is of the Bayanis in Baghdad, in Edirne, and then later in Palestine, in the city of Acre. So this is where this all emerges. I obviously had to find all of this out myself over time. My Morshid, a very interesting gentleman who I initially met in 1992, when he found out in those early 90s that I was estranged from the Baha'i community, he revealed to me that not only was he a Sufi master, but that he was a secretly practicing Azali, a Bayani. And in Iran, amongst a lot of the tariqas, contrary to what the Hawza does, the seminary does, you often find these multiple identities amongst the Sufis. You find it especially, for example, amongst the Yarsan or Ahl Haq Sufis, where they're not only practicing Yarsan and they adhere to the doctrine of the Ahl Haq, but they're also, mingling with various Sufi orders, whether we're talking about the Qadiris or prominently one of the Sufi lines that I'm affiliated with, the Khaksar Jalali order. So the Ahl Haq, kind of go back and forth between their own communities in Azerbaijan and Iranian Kurdistan, and the Khaksaris who, are dispersed all over Iran. and have quite a presence in the province of Mazandaran as well, particularly in the jungles. So this sort of thing is not unheard of. And in my case, this was the situation with my own Morshid. And when he initiated me not only in the name of the masters of the lineages that he had a permission for, an ijaza, which were the Safi Ali Shahi branch of the Ni'matullahi order, the Kurdish branch of the Qadari order, and also the Khaksar order. But he also initiated me in the names of the Bab, his Letters of the Living, and Wahid Azal. And we had a very interesting relationship during the time that we were together. Most of his murids were completely unaware of this affiliation. I think maybe one other person you may have known. But one thing he did encourage me is when he found out my own family pedigree, is that I should, really delve deeper into this family history and look at it, because a great historical wrong occurred. And this historical wrong that occurred at the hands of the Baha'is, the very group that I, at the time, in those years of the early 90s, was moving out of. To make a long story short, at least in this particular segment of it, I ended up becoming one of the most vocal enemies of this organization online. Now, before I go further, I should also mention that, my problem is with the doctrine, the organization, and the political reality of this thing.
Yes.
Individuals are good and bad. Yes, certain ideas, certain doctrines, certain things influence people. That is a given. And they take on that hue. The Surah Al-Baqarah is a great psychological text explaining these sorts of things. But by and large, let's separate, at least on one level, individuals from the idea and the organization.
Yes.
But the organization in and of itself is an extremely sinister, dubious organization, has been from its inception. I mean, if an organization that is born out of a schism, illegitimately usurping an earlier movement and attempting to subsume and absorb that movement, by definition, doesn't have anything but the seed of negation within it from the very outset. Yeah. And we've seen examples of this throughout history in multiple fronts, not just, this. But this is what we're dealing with. So the Baha'is initially, and to this very moment, have been nothing more and nothing less than an extension and an arm of Anglo-American imperialism. At the time when the Tsarist Empire was around, they also were in alliance with them. The Tsarists gave them a piece of land so they could build a headquarters in the city of Ashgabat, which is in modern-day Turkmenistan. Once the Bolshevik Revolution happened, somewhere around the 1920s, under Stalin, the Soviets decided that these people were bad news. They expelled them. And in the early 1930s, this structure they had erected in the town of Ashgabat collapsed. And that was the situation of the Baha'is in the former Soviet Union until the collapse of the Eastern Bloc itself, when they then started going back over there and establishing a presence, whatnot. To cut to the chase, the basic thrust of Baha'ism is globalism on steroids. Now, when we talk about globalism, I make a dichotomy between internationalism on the one hand, which is the solidarity of average people throughout the globe, and globalism. Globalism is not the solidarity of average people across the globe. Globalism is basically the alliance of elites, and particularly plutocrats, the upper middle classes, upper bourgeoisie, and particularly in hoarding wealth and the ability to move beyond borders, or have borders have no relevance to these people. So, they can take their money from one jurisdiction and put it in another jurisdiction so they don't have to pay tax, or they take their profits and they put it into offshore places where, they're under the jurisdiction of no government or tax office. Those are the globalists. Those people like, Bezos, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, George Soros, and all these very similar kinds of figures. These are the globalists, right? Yes. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the conspiracy culture, because they don't have methods of fine tuning and fine honing distinction between things, lump a lot of people and a lot of things into the category of globalism that shouldn't be there. And then they beat a dead horse with that. Baha'is are globalists. The Baha'is are globalists, and I would argue that the Baha'is are the original globalists. So at a time when the imperial powers of Europe were still kind of constrained by their own territories and what have you, in the latter half of the 19th century, the Baha'is were moving around between borders all throughout Asia and Southeast Asia, whatnot, North America, South America, all the way to Australia. And this is one of the reasons why the Western establishments particularly have always found this organization extremely amenable for agendas that they want to implement. And contrary to the received narrative, for example, of the founding of the State of Israel, as it's beginning to emerge now, as we're getting closer to 100 years since the founding of the State of Israel, is that the Baha'is played an extremely central role long before even the beginning of the British mandate in Palestine after the end of the First World War, in the establishment of the State of Israel and in the whole Zionist project. This occurs particularly given the fact that in 1891, about a year before the death of Baha'u'llah, we have evidence of this because it was disclosed by the Hebrew University scholar Moshe Sharon, that Baha'u'llah began a communication with the Rothschild family in London. So this would have been Nathaniel the Rothschild. And a few years after that, in 1897, we have the first Zionist World Congress in Basel, Switzerland, headed by Theodor Herzl. And immediately on top of that, the then leader of the Baha'is, Abbas Effendi Abdul Baha, issues this statement about how the Jews are coming back to the land of Palestine. And very soon, they will become the envy of the world and they will reestablish their kingdom over there. We're talking about almost 50 years before the founding of the State of Israel at this point. Practically speaking, as you have these Eastern European Jews coming to the Middle East at a time where the Ottomans are basically refusing Zionists, any kind of leverage, it was the Baha'is that were the real estate agents of these arriving Zionists. So these are documents and discussions that the Haifa University scholar Soli Shahbar himself has been writing about and speaking about in public. We know that a lot of this area of Haifa Aker, of northern Israel, Palestine, the Baha'is had bought a lot of real estate. And that's another question, where did the money come from? But that, we can get to that at some point. They were buying up Arab properties and large, farmlands, lots of it, on the cheap. And then once these European Jews came to Palestine, they were selling these properties for 10 times the value to these arriving European Jews. But this shows that the initial establishment of a Zionist presence in Palestine was facilitated very directly by the Baha'is. And it goes even beyond the issue of selling them real estate. It was also, they became basically their guides in that region, because you had these Eastern European Jews, they had no idea how that society, that Ottoman Arab society of the late 19th century, early 20th century operated. So the Baha'is became their guides. So once we come to the era of the First World War, and in Ottoman Turkey itself, there has been lots of changes. You had the Young Turk Revolution occur in 1909, which had a very ultra-nationalist ideology. When we come to that era, we find that the Ottoman administration begins to become very hostile towards the Baha'i patriarch Abbas Effendi Abdul Baha, to the point that they threatened to kill him because they figured out that he was acting as a fifth column agent and spy for the British war effort. So once the war broke out, and there's multiple testimony of this, he was giving information to the British war effort, which was headquartered in Cairo, not too far away. So when the British finally invade Palestine in around late 1916, 1917, one of the claims that the British High Command makes out of Cairo is that they actually came to save Abbas Effendi Abdul Baha, right? So this proves that he was their agent. 2 years later, in 1919, he is officially knighted by the British Empire. And the Baha'is have claimed that this was due to humanitarian services that he was doing in Haifa Acre. Once one looks at the actual documentation of the knighting itself, the documentation is unequivocal that he was knighted for the reason of services rendered unto the British government. So this had nothing to do with humanitarian services. Then we have about a year or two after that, just right after the Conference of Versailles, we have the establishment of the British Mandate for Palestine, which exists from 2021 all the way to the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. And during this time, you have the leadership of Abbas Effendi's grandson, Shoghi Effendi, and this relationship between the Zionists and the Baha'is gets even deeper and deeper. And so in 1948, in May 1948, when the State of Israel is declared, one of the first religious dignitaries of Palestine that actually recognizes and congratulates David Ben-Gurion is none other than Shoghi Effendi, the head patriarch of the Baha'i organization. Now, all throughout this time, leading up to it, within Europe and within Iran, you have the Baha'is infiltrating the seats of power. In England, especially in Britain, for example, the Persian section of the BBC that was established just on the eve of the invasion of Iran in 1941 by the British and Soviet Union. This was established with Mr. Hassan Mu'aqqar Balyuzi, who was known as a hand of the cause of God by the Baha'is. He was the first spokesman of the Persian section of the BBC that would nightly, on the eve of the invasion of Iran in 1941, would be agitating propaganda against the Iranian government. This also occurred about 12 years later during the period when the British and the Americans sought to topple the government of Mohammad Mossadegh over the nationalization of oil. Mr. Hassan Mu'aqqar Balyuzi then was also the spokesperson, the official voice that people heard in Persian from the Persian section of the BBC. Within Iran itself, when you look at the period just before the fall of the Qajar dynasty, you begin to see that the Baha'is are being positioned by a British presence in Iran. This British presence consolidated itself on a military level during the First World War. And in around 1921, you have a coup d'etat in Tehran. Two individuals are brought to Tehran. One is a Cossack, a former Cossack soldier by the name of Reza Maxim, who ends up becoming the first Pahlavi king, Reza Shah. And the second individual is an individual by the name of Sayyid Ziauddin Tabatabai, a very interesting guy, an Anglophile to his dying breath. But what has come out of research over the last 20, 30 years is that the main handler of Reza Maxim, or Reza Shah, was an individual by the name of Ardeshir Reporter, a successor to Manakji Limji Hatariya, the Parsi agent that I mentioned before. And he was also the go-between with the Baha'i community of Iran. And he was he was a British Secret Service agent in Iran. So the facilitation of the rise of Reza Shah apparently occurs through the facility and the help of the Baha'i community of Iran for a number of reasons, one of which is that they also wanted to cut to size the influence of the Baha'i community of Iran at the time, because for most of the period of the constitutional revolution, all the way up to that point of 1921, the Baha'i community had managed to establish itself as a political force within Iran. Number one, to curb the power of the monarchy, then the Qajar dynasty, and to also curb the power and influence of the reactionary mullahs in Iran. So once 1921 comes around and they bring Reza Shah to power, by 1925, when he crowns himself as the first Pahlavi king, the position of the Baha'is within Tehran especially is consolidated. So the minute that Reza Shah takes the throne, one of the first things that he does is that he sends all of the very prominent Baha'i figures, such as Mirza Yahya Dolat Abadi, Furuqi, and other prominent individuals. He basically sends them into a period of house arrest, a period that lasts for almost 16 years. Yahya Dawlat al-Wadi, he was a very prominent Bayani at the time, leaves Iran altogether, ends up settling in Brussels, first in Berlin and then later in Brussels in Europe. And you have a steady infiltration and presence from that point forward of Baha'is within the royal court of the Shah himself, the Reza Pahlavi, the first Pahlavi king. Particularly at a time when you have this very dubious pseudo-physician by the name of Ayadi. This was the Shah's physician. He was the physician to first Reza Shah, and then after 1941, he became a very close confidant to Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, the former Shah himself. And then over time, over the next 20, 30, 40 years, there's more and more of a consolidation of the Baha'i presence within the royal court, but then also simultaneously within the Iranian economy. So once we come to the period of Muhammad Mossadegh, what the community that pulled rank immediately behind Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, the minute that he and Soraya left Iran, were the Baha'is. And this happens in Rome because there were two coup attempts in August 1953. The first coup attempt fails, and the Shah and Soraya leave Iran, first to Baghdad and then to Rome, but they leave penniless. And a business tycoon industrialist by the name of Habib Sabit Pasal, a Baha'i, ends up basically bankrolling the few days that the Shah and Soraya stay in Rome. So once the coup d'etat against Mossadegh succeeds a few days later and they return, basically the Shah owes this gentleman and his community even more than before. And what ends up happening over the next 25 years is that the Pepsi Cola franchise and then next the radio television franchise are given to Habib Sabit. And from this, more and more sectors of the Iranian economy at the time are represented by these people. We find, for example, educational curriculum being, very subtly changed in very pro-Baha'i direction. But there were also elements within the royal court, particularly from the direction of the Shah's able court minister, Asadullah Alam, were also resisting all of this, so that you find that during the period of the Pahlavi monarchy and dictatorship, even though the Baha'is tried very hard to get an official recognition of their creed within Iran, from that angle, there was resistance to it. But nevertheless, they had most of the economy or the modernized economy in their hands. And from the late 1960s onwards, they even had the Shah's secret police in their hand. So the deputy head of Savak, a man by the name of Parviz Sabeti, who was effectively the ruler of Savak, because the head of Savak was very much a ceremonial role, then headed by a guy by the name of Owaisi. Parviz Sabeti was a Baha'i, and he was a Baha'i that came from the very same town and city that Mr. Ayadi, Ghulam Hussein Ayadi, came from. This is a village in the Iranian province of Lorestan, known as Sangisar, where the entire village are Baha'is. And another individual that came out of this village was an individual by the name of Hojab Yazdani. And Hojab Yazdani, for lack of a better way of putting it, was the chief Cosa Nostra mafia figure in Iran during the last 2 decades of the Pahlavi era. Matters came to such a point with Hojab Yazdani that in the early 1970s, he attempted to buy out the Iranian National Bank and had to be thwarted by force by the prime minister of the time, Amir Abbas al-Bayda, to prevent him from doing so. But this gives you a bird's eye view of the kind of power that this community had accumulated in Iran of the Pahlavis. Meanwhile, the clerics and the Hosa and all of these people were agitating because they understood that Iran was being very steadily taken over by this cult. The Shah, for all of the things that are said about him, was an extremely whimsical and weak character. And up until about 1977, when his court minister, Asadullah Alam, was alive, everything was under check. But the minute that he dies, Asadullah Alam, from cancer, Iran unravels, basically. And almost 18 months later, the country descends into revolution. And you find, Ayatollah Khomeini comes back and becomes the supreme leader of that. which in itself is a extremely interesting story, because Ayatollah Khomeini was not meant to become the preeminent and penultimate leader of that revolution that toppled the palace. In fact, the real mover and shaker, the man who really pushed matters to the point that Iran's monarchy finally collapsed, was none other than the figure of Dr. Ali Shariati, who is probably the most interesting character, both as an intellectual and as a political activist, that came out of that era that one will find. Ali Shariati's ideas are basically the ideas that have galvanized not only Iran, but also much of the resistance movements that you find, for example, in Lebanon today and whatnot. But Ali Shariati's ideas are extremely dangerous, not just to imperialists and their lackeys, but also to the traditional clerical class of the Hawza, the seminary. Because Ali Shariati presented a typology which he called, red Shiism and black Shiism, where he makes the argument quite convincingly that this authoritarian structure of the Shiite clergy that we find today has its genesis within the period of the Safavid dynasty of the 15th to 17th century. And, he instances various figures who are responsible that, in my opinion, we can actually push this back even further a couple of centuries and find the genesis of reactionary Twelver Shiism, or the Twelver Shia institutional hierarchy, probably to the time of the Sharif al-Murtaza around the 11th century. But Ali Shariati located there, so in his opinion, reactionary Shiism, black Shiism, was represented by the Shiism of the Safavids, whereas he then juxtaposed and counterpoised this with the Shiism of Ali, which he called and labeled red Shiism. Now, what a lot of people don't understand when they read the text of Ali Shariati, and these are facts that only now are beginning to emerge with documentation and analysis, but were known about among certain sectors, is that Dr. Ali Shariati and his father, the late Dr. Muhammad Taqi Shariati, were both secretly Babis. They were secret Azali Babis, Bayanis. And they figured that it made no sense for the Bayani community to pursue its angle of activism in fighting the reaction of both the monarchy and the clergy in Iran through, overtly propagating and proselytizing the ideas of the Bayan. They figured that it would serve a better purpose is that they propagated the ideas of the Bayan, the progressive ideas of the Bayan, through the prism of a reinterpretation of Shiism itself, but also by bringing, characters such as Karl Marx and the various intellectual figures of the West, such as Jean-Paul Sartre, etc. So Ali Shariati went to Paris. He studied briefly under the great Islamologist, Professor Louis Massignon, the man who wrote the definitive study of the Sufi al-Hallaj. Met with Jean-Paul Sartre, met with various very interesting Marxist sociologists in Paris. And all of these ideas then basically percolated and syncretized into the doctrine that Ali Shariati then presented in his books and lectures. But behind this, the motor running the whole show secretly was the ideas of the Bab and the ideas of the Bayan, and it's particularly the ideas of the Persian Bayan. Kayvan Yahyai and I did a podcast back at the end of last year, basically touching on some facets of this. Luckily, we have the communication of Dr. Ali Shariati with one of the prominent members of the Bayani community of the 1970s, Miss Parveen Dolat Abadi, and her sister Fakhretaj Dolat Abadi. These all now exist and have been publicized by Harvard University on a page that they built called the Women's World in Qajar, Iran. So the evidence is now beginning to emerge. If one analyzes the text of certain of Dr. Ali Shariati's lectures, some of these ideas are kind of gleaned as well. But now we're also finding that during the era itself, that there were various clerics, beginning with Ayatollah Makarim Shirazi, and also one of his distant kinspeople, the late Ayatollah, not Tabatabai, the one that was murdered by the group Furqan, Mutahari, Ayatollah Mutahari, were very well aware of the fact that Dr. Ali Shariati was a secret Bayani, and that he was actually propagating through the prism of revolutionary Islam the ideas of the Bab. But Dr. Ali Shariati was also on the target of Savak and Parviz Sabati, its Baha'i deputy chief. And in 1977, he narrowly escaped Iran by the skin of his teeth when Savak was after him, and ended up first in France again, but then in Southampton, England. And in the late summer of 1977, he very mysteriously collapses of a heart attack at the house of a friend and dies at a very young age. There was never an autopsy made of Dr. Ali Shariati. One of the first people that arrived on the scene, an individual I find extremely suspicious, is Dr. Abdul Karim Surush, who's a very prominent dissident, Iranian dissident now living in Canada. Surush was present when the body of Ali Shariati was retrieved from the morgue of the hospital that they had taken him to. Dr. Abdul Karim Surush ends up, after the revolution, becoming basically the engine of the Ayatollah Khomeini's so-called cultural revolution within the universities, which was a complete mess. And then sometime after that, he himself falls afoul of the system. Iran ends up leaving in the 90s. But Dr. Shariati is very important because had Dr. Shariati lived, arguably, the revolution of Iran of 1978-79 would have not gone in the reactionary direction and totalitarian direction that it did. And conversations that I have had with people such as Dr. Robert Dreyfuss, this is the older brother of the actor Richard Dreyfuss, who used to be with the LaRouche organization, but then he went his own separate way and wrote several books, very important ones. One of which is a book that he published in 1980-81 known as Hostage to Khomeini. There's a little tidbit in that book, and he didn't source this, where he pretty unequivocally claims that the Khomeini movement of 1978-1979 had in the background substantial Baha'i support. And this struck me as truth. So I tried to track down the author, and it took me about a 5-6 year period to track him down. I finally tracked him down when I was living in London. We had a series of Skype conversations, and he said that his research with documentation that the LaRouche organization at the time had advised him not to source proved that indeed this was the case, that big Baha'i plutocrats such as Habib Sabit that I mentioned before, and others, people with ties to some of the human rights organizations in the West, like Amnesty International, etc., during the period of 78-79, were from the background funding the Khomeini movement. Now, the reason for that is known, although not widely appreciated, and that is because in 1962-63, there was a uprising led by the Ayatollah Khomeini from the city of Qom. And it was through the facility and the intervention of two Baha'i lawyers that were assigned to him that he managed to get out of Iran and into exile in Iraq at Najaf. And in other words, his life was saved by the Baha'is. Now, when this is where things get extremely bizarre, because when you look at Iran's major issue, at least in the public media, seems to be with the Baha'is. But when you scratch underneath the surface, this is all a facade. The Islamic Republic of Iran has never had a real problem with the Baha'is. This has all been a game. And they haven't had a problem with these people for a very simple reason, is because at various stages, they have actually served each other's agendas and purposes and kept each other, in a sense, relevant and afloat. Today in Iran, we have a situation not too dissimilar to the situation that prevailed in the 1970s and 1960s, despite the claim of a lot of the Baha'is in the West and with Western human rights organizations. They have infiltrated substantial areas of the bureaucracy and apparatus and whatnot of the Islamic Republic, all the way into the office of Ayatollah Khamenei. And so this relationship is, whether it's a relationship of convenience or what have you, we can debate that. But going back to the period immediately after the revolution in Iran, an event that occurs that the late head of the secret police or the intelligence ministry of the Islamic Republic, the first one, as a matter of fact, Dr. Saeed Hajjarian, disclosed to myself and my comrade Kayvan Yahyai, is that in late 1979, almost immediately after the death of Ayatollah Talaqani, we have several members of the leadership of the Baha'is in Iran disappear in Tehran. One of whom was a university professor by the name of Ali Murad Davoudi, an expert on the philosophy of Aristotle, much beloved by his students and the staff and faculty of the university, a person who had not been targeted, incidentally, by the Cultural Revolution of the Ayatollah Khomeini and Abdul Karim Soroush. These people are disappeared and assumed dead. Nothing further has ever been seen of these people, heard from these people. Immediately, the Baha'is claimed that the Islamic Republic was responsible for their disappearance. The Islamic Republic for years has denied the charge that they had nothing to do with whatever happened to these people. But the story that emerged both from Mr. Hajjarian and from several other sources was that these individuals were actually murdered and disappeared as an inside job by Habib Sabit Pasal himself through the facility of an insider that he had within the then Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution, the Revolutionary Council, and that was Hujjatul Islam Bahunar. Bahunar was a prominent mid-level cleric, an ally of the Ayatollah Khomeini. It turns out, incidentally, now that a lot of his extended family in Kerman and the villages outside of it around Rafsanjan are actually Baha'is themselves. So that kind of shows you that within even the vicinity and the circle of many of these prominent founders of the Islamic Revolution, you had a very sizable Baha'i presence. And through that facility, these prominent Baha'is went missing and were murdered as an inside job for a very simple reason, is because in late 1978-79, when Habib Sabit Pasal left Iran and went to the United States, he extracted illegally the funds of two private Baha'i banks. He took their entire assets, right, and left Iran. Right when there are all these disturbances and protests and street fights between the military and the people is going on. And these people found out about it and went and complained after the revolution. And as this was getting more and more traction and publicity, these people disappeared. To cover it up, the Universal House of Justice, which is the supreme governing body of the Baha'is that is based out of Haifa, Palestine, from that point forward forbade any Baha'is to talk about this case. And so to this day, if you ask any of the Baha'is what happened to the first National Spiritual Assembly after the revolution in Iran, they all remain quiet. So right there, what this demonstrates is the nature of the mafia kind of dynamic that occurs within this organization, even amongst itself. So these people were killed, went missing. A few years after that, within the United States itself, a prominent member of the Baha'i leadership in America, a gentleman by the name of Dan Jordan, who was the founder of a pedagogy known as Anisa. He had found out about this as well and was making quite a lot of noise. On a trip that he went from San Diego to New York City, in JFK Airport, he goes missing. And a few days later, he's found dead and decapitated in a dumpster. One account says outside Connecticut, another account says outside of JFK Airport itself. The New York Port Authority and the FBI investigate, and they basically find no clues as to what happened. The rumor that is started by the Baha'is themselves amongst their own community to first, to explain what had happened, they first blamed the Islamic Republic. This very quickly turns out to be nonsense. Later, they manufactured a story that Mr. Dan Jordan had been a homosexual and that he had gone to procure sex, and that this had from a male prostitute, and that this had all gone bad, and he had found himself murdered subsequently. Nothing can be further from the truth. This man was married, he had a family, he was a prominent figure, a psychologist, a pedagogist, an educator. He had gone from San Diego to New York for conference. So this story can very safely be dismissed. So this tells you the nature of this organization in the way that it operates with its own internal dissidents, especially on the level of power, is very similar to the way the mafia operates, with its own, with its own people. So from that, we can extract that a lot of the propaganda and the public image that these Baha'is present about themselves is a false image. So all these platitudes that they preach about peace and brotherhood and friendship and kumbaya, this has no reality. This is just a gimmick, it's a propaganda and a marketing gimmick, and has no further reality beyond it. Now, I came out of this organization, I fell afoul. Luckily, my hand was taken by a great murshid who gave me also a lot of responsibility just before he passed on, about what to do in the future, which I'm now, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, I've been realizing slowly. He saw all of this coming, and he advised me that, it was incumbent, for the sake of history, for posterity, and also for the sake of God and humanity alike, that I stand firm as a rock against this organization by any means necessary, preserve myself, because there would be great things would come out of it as a result. And this is what I've done. I have followed his advice to the T. God rest his soul. And yes, a lot of great things have come out of it, but nevertheless, these people have targeted me, and not just myself, my family as well. They targeted my parents, especially as I pulled my parents out of this organization. My father's a very rapid decline into cancer in the year of 2011 is quite suspicious. Granted, he was an ill man, overworked over a number of years. He had high blood pressure and was a diabetic. But he, this cancer that took his life at the beginning of 2012 came with such rapidity that even one particular doctor that I consulted in Germany with his file said that it was not normal that a cancer proceeds at that level of speed to take somebody's life. The death of my wife, my beloved Roya, is in a similar light in 2019. This was at a time then when Kayvon Yahya and I were making podcasts on a weekly basis, discussing a lot of these issues. We had made 3 particular podcasts which were incredibly controversial, two of which was part 1 and 2 of a podcast known as the Baha'i Mafia, where we discuss in detail much of this stuff. And another one was about the career of this Hassan Mu'akkar Balyuzi that I mentioned before. And because there is a precedent for this sort of activity by these Baha'is historically, we assumed that there were a collusion of several forces that made this happen. Now, for the few years just leading up to Roya's passing, I had been very actively engaged, standing very firm against Alexander Dugin and his Russian fascist networks online that were infiltrating every nook and cranny of the anti-imperialist scene, all throughout the internet, particularly in social media and elsewhere. And one of the dox blogs that these people made against me, this dox blog made by a guy claiming to be, calling himself under the handle of Akira Kalashnikov. And the blog is entitled The Fourth Revolutionary War. This guy very explicitly lets it drop that he was contacted the Baha'is. And the way that he's crafted his language, one can sometimes dismiss it as being, kind of a trolling, but I don't believe that is the case, and neither does the German police. And so this, in a sense, became a very important piece of the puzzle and evidence about the levels of collusion that occurs between the Baha'is and various international actors, even if their ideologies and their points of view may sometimes be diametrically opposed. And so the German criminal police, the federal criminal police known as the Bundeskriminalamt, believe that there may have been some form of collusion between the Baha'is and the Duganists, or far-right organizations in Germany associated with them that were stalking Roya and I, because we were also getting constant death threats from these people, whether on Facebook or email or elsewhere, and that whatever happened would have been with the involvement of these people. The German criminal police has at least on paper, dismissed the claims of the coroner, of Roya, for the same reason that the toxicologist dismissed the claims of the coroner. The coroner had claimed, without any demonstration, that my wife died of a diabetic stroke. This would have been impossible, particularly as our doctor, our GP in Berlin proved, because only 2 months before that, both of us had blood tests. In fact, I was the guy with the problems with high cholesterol. Roya's blood sugar levels were normal. Her cholesterol level was normal. Everything was normal. And so nobody goes from that level.
Sheikh, can you hear me? Just bear with us, everybody. It looks like we're being attacked by the cult.
This happened. We got cut off there for a second.
Yeah, I think we got attacked by the cult.
They do these sorts of things on a regular basis.
I'm scared. I hope it didn't erase any of what we were doing, what you have already processed.
I don't think it will, but you may have to actually then, bring two videos together to, edit a little bit and bring two videos together.
Yeah.
Anyway,
it looks like you were really hitting them where it hurts. So that's why they attacked my laptop.
It happens. Are we recording now?
Yeah, it says that we're being recorded. Okay. I'm just I'm worried that what you said before the interruption, that nothing really went away.
Inshallah, nothing went away. But if it did go away, we can do this again, and I will hit them even harder.
But I agree. I agree completely. I mean, there have been instances where I heard people are being attacked by these occult energy weapons and different forms of gang stalking that you and Sister Roya, God rest her soul in peace, have experienced, what your father experienced. So these cultists, even with this gentleman that I speak to, Douglas Dietrich, he describes these people as the cults of the kings of Edom. That's what he describes them as. So he calls them Edomites, that you can find them in all races, religions, countries of the world. And he himself, especially with the type of information that he's given on Islam, that you will find these cultists that will come after you. And you are describing your battle against these cultists of the New World Order. And for our viewers that are watching, who will watch this on YouTube, you see how this conversation has been interrupted and why Sheikh Wahid Azal is telling you the truth. And I can attest to that as well, and why we need to support this beloved brother in his struggle against the darkness in order to honor his father's soul, honor his late wife's soul, and all of the heartbreak and struggles that he has endured in his life, that we have to basically be in this struggle together. So again, back to you, Sheikh, and sorry for the interruption.
No, that's okay. It's happened. I mean, this is business as usual for me. But what I was saying is that, Roya's passing was extremely suspicious. And whether we get a resolution as to what had happened or not, we will see. It took German authorities well over a decade to resolve the NSU murders. This was the National Socialist Underground murders that was murdering all kinds of leftists and Turks and whatnot in Germany all throughout the 90s and then the Zeros. But one theory that is now emerging about what could have happened and what poison may have been used against my wife. And it's just very scary, because the day that this may have happened was the day that Roya and my little one were out doing errands together. So whoever stalked my wife was stalking my child at the same time. And the police theorize that it is possible, this is the Federal Criminal Bureau of Investigation in Germany, they theorize that it's very possible that the poison that may have been used to murder Roya with was coolant. The coolant that you have in cars. And they speculate on this basis that these coolants have an extremely toxic agent that if it especially meets with water, boiling water at a certain temperature, it creates a chemical reaction that can potentially kill somebody within somewhere between a 3 to 8 hour period, if that is consumed. And so they think that that it is possible at one of the cafes that Roya and my child had stopped during the course of the day, that somebody in one of these cafes may have dropped a few drops of this stuff in her coffee. And because the half-life is very short, so you're talking about from the period that you ingest it to the moment that it activates and shuts down the body, 8 hour period, this thing leaves no traces. So this coroner, now whether they were getting instructions for the district attorney or we don't know, but would not have detected anything of the sort. What I found very strange about the report that the coroner put out, and this was observed by myself and the ambulance medics that showed up, that my wife didn't have a pulse. And according to one of the people that the police in Germany introduced me to, one of the first things that this kind of fluid, this kind of poison does is it attacks the cardiovascular system. So your heart shuts down immediately. Roya didn't have a pulse. When I found her in that state that night, the first thing I observed is that she had no pulse. The ambulance medics observed this. Nowhere do you find that in the report, in the coroner's report. Even though the ambulance medics had highlighted this, they had put her on an electrocardiogram machine. They had injected her with adrenaline, which is all the standard procedures to try to revive somebody. But nowhere in the coroner's report did this show up. And this is what has gotten the federal police, the German police, suspicious. And last year actually proved their suspicions correct, because apparently sympathizers of the German far right, the AfD party, were in the office of the Berlin district attorney, the Staatsanwaltschaft.
Yeah.
And in August of last year, you had a similar incident happen in central Berlin near the Reichstag building that happened on January 6th in Washington, D.C. You had a bunch of these right-wing nutcases try to storm the Reichstag building, and they were arrested. And a dozen of the people arrested locally from Berlin ended up being these employees of the office of the Berlin district attorney. They were demonstrating against the masking and the mandates for masking for COVID-19. So this says that this nexus goes very far. Keivan Yahyai and two of the former secretaries of this woman that we were associated with, who had been an AfD whistleblower, claimed to me after Roya's passing that in 2015, a former prominent Baha'i of Germany had actually been seen at one of the AfD rallies, this Alternative for Deutschland. And this was the main group that in our part of Berlin, in this district of Pankow, in the north part of it, this was the electorate that in the election of 2017 had fallen to the AfD. So these are one of the reasons why there's a lot of suspicion that there is collusion, there is possibly there was a murder afoot. And it is a result of this and the advice that these people gave to me that I should leave Germany because it was not safe for either myself or my daughter to be over there. This is why we came to Australia in December of 2019. Since that time, the Baha'is have been a little bit muted. However, they have also tried their various underhanded methods. Luckily, the most recent cases of which I have actually neutralized, one of which was, I relate this in the first podcast that we made. I was approached by an Iranian gentleman claiming to be a journalist for The Independent. UK, the Persian section of it, who wanted to do an interview with me about the Bayani community, Azali Babis. But this individual proved themselves extremely incompetent. This guy couldn't run his Skype properly so that he could actually hear me. So I, basically told the guy, let's go to Zoom. We went to Zoom. He didn't know how to record with the Zoom. So I ended up recording the interview with this journalist and sending the content to him afterward. This thing never got published. So I took the raw footage and put it on my YouTube. Immediately, him and his editorial board attempted to claim copyright over the video that was produced out of my computer.
Yeah.
And YouTube took their word for it. So I, through legal aid locally here, I went to court and obtained a court order against, this kind of action by YouTube, because this is fraud. If something is produced from your facility, unless you have a contract with somebody where you have transferred whatever it is, whether it be a video or a piece of property or whatever it is, unless there's a legal contract existing where you have transferred this, that content is your copyright. It is yours. Yes. So nobody can legally come and claim that. And whether a corporation or an entity or a third party or fourth party attempts to do that are engaging in fraud in every jurisdiction. But this interview that Mr. Amir Sultanzadeh conducted with me was obviously very challenging and very incendiary to the interests of the Baha'i mafia in the UK, who in the media landscape, in the Persian language media landscape of the UK, are everywhere. They are, they completely dominate the BBC. They are now in the Independent. These satellite networks like Manoto TV, etc., are all dominated and packed with Baha'is, some of whom are extremely shady characters. You have one particular character who claims to be a sociologist, this guy by the name of Irfan Sabiti, who's regularly rubbing shoulders with very violent Kurdish extremist groups and the representatives on his Manoto TV. These are people responsible for mass murder of other Kurds in Iranian Kurdistan. Yet, you hear from the Baha'is when they feign innocence to human rights organizations and to the public at large that they're apolitical, that they're being targeted by the Iranian government for their religious beliefs. It's not true. They are not targeted by the Iranian government for their religious beliefs. By and large, to its credit, the Iranian government has been actually quite standoffish and very allowing of people's belief systems, as quirky as sometimes these may get, as long as they didn't encroach on the law and as long as they didn't, become too, obnoxious. So that entire narrative that the Baha'is have claimed for the last 40 years that they're being persecuted for their religion is complete nonsense. And I don't say this as someone who is sympathetic to the Islamic Republic of Iran, because I don't believe in the Vilayat al-Faqih, the guardianship of the jurisprudence. I don't believe in the legitimacy of the mullahs and the theocracy of Iran. These people hijacked the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So I am not coming and saying this from a perspective of a sympathetic party. And I'm saying it actually from the perspective of someone who's hostile to the mullahs as well. So there is no human rights issue. Maybe occasionally human rights issues are manufactured to keep these people relevant. Yeah. Which is what happens to with a lot of these sorts of groups like them throughout the world. Yet, in the region, you see the Baha'is are very close also to the various Gulf Arab sheikhs and the Gulf Arab leaderships, whether we're talking about the Emirates or within the kingdom itself. In the kingdom, they have to be very careful. So although they have a sizable presence in the kingdom, they keep their activities on the lowdown and under the radar. But in the Emirates, in Qatar, in Bahrain, they're just very blatant about it. And they're extremely close to the ruling families of all these places. And obviously in Israel itself. But one thing I wanted to mention, and I hope there are, Israelis tuning in and listening to this, and hopefully even from the government of Israel and even the Mossad, hopefully. And maybe they will learn something. No matter what they take the Baha'is as, in the long term, the Baha'is are also a security threat to Israel itself for a very specific reason. They have gone on record for a long time to their pilgrims who go to Haifa, Israel, or Palestine, and have claimed that one day Israel will collapse and the Baha'is, and particularly their Universal of Justice, will become the authority and the government of that region. Now, even though we may not be friendly towards the Zionists, the Zionists need to be on notice that these people who they have allowed all these allowances to build these fancy gardens and buildings on top of Mount Carmel are not really their long-term friends. That these people are also biding their time in that region against the Jews and Arabs, Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. And this is why I've gone on record many times saying that it would actually serve the interests of peace in the region for the Israelis to basically get rid of these people and the presence of the Baha'is out of Palestine. They are welcome to take over those gardens and those buildings for themselves, to localize it and be in control of those buildings themselves. But the Baha'is are a threat to even Israel. And one of the reasons in which we do not have peace, we do not have a long-term peace between Arab and Jew, is for a very specific reason, is that because a lot of the properties on Mount Carmel and in that area of northern Israel that have been bought by the Baha'is were bought, this is recently, after the period of 1948, on the property of absentee Palestinian landlords. So one of the biggest points of contention where you cannot have a Jewish-Arab, peace and resolution to this conflict is because of the issue of the right to return. But when the Baha'is have taken over most of Mount Carmel on properties that used to belong to absentee Palestinian landlords, then this issue of the right of return becomes an extremely complicated issue for a long-term resolution. So they themselves, these Baha'is, are actually an impediment to peace between Arab and Jew. And this is why I'm saying that the Zionists need to also think about their own future with these people. But overall, this organization, this community, this presence is extremely dangerous for the common weal of humanity, in my opinion, particularly because they are very unequivocal about the fact that they wish to establish a global theocracy of their own doctrine throughout the world. That they very unashamedly use the term New World Order. It's part of the doctrine of the Baha'i faith. And in implementing this, every caricature that is usually attributed to the Jews about being everywhere and infiltrating everything is actually true about the Baha'is. Even though they are a very small community compared to others, yet you find them in the world of high finance. So they are people all over Goldman Sachs and HSBC, and we're talking in top executive positions. You will find them everywhere in the American and the British military industrial complex, whether on the level of government or the private, arms contracting industry. They're everywhere in telecommunications and the high tech world of Silicon Valley, and also its Israeli version, which is actually now headquartered in Haifa, and on and on and on and on it goes. And what does that tell any person of sound reason is that other than the fact that these people are very carefully positioning themselves for a long-term takeover,
That makes complete sense, because even with Iran getting a bad rep, Sheikh, about them wanting to exterminate the Baha'is, if they really wanted to exterminate them, they would outlaw them completely. So if they exist there, then that kind of contradicts the narrative. So that basically shows that there is something else which is the average public is not being educated about, and that's where you come in.
Yeah, and they are look, if the Islamic Revolution and the Ayatollah Khomeini wanted to eradicate the Baha'is and liquidate them, all it would have required was the Khomeini to pass a fatwa, a takfir, and that would have been it. In a environment and in an atmosphere of revolutionary turmoil, as you found in 1979, all the way to 1983, that was like drinking water for the revolutionary, or the so-called revolutionary leadership of Iran at the time. But they never did it. Ayatollah Khomeini never issued a fatwa, never takfired the Baha'is publicly. None of that ever occurred. And so these discussions and these claims of human rights, that they're, one term that they've used is cultural genocide. This is all nonsense. This has no reality. it sounds great and it's very gimmicky when you go to, in front of, the US Congress or European, the parliaments of European governments or in the UK or here in Australia. But the truth of the matter is it has no reality. Now, these governments in the West seem not to care about evidence, no matter how much you tell them, because I have been writing Australian parliamentarians, American congressmen. Even while I was in Germany, I was writing to members of the German Bundestag on a regular basis. My wife was as well. That these claims that this organization are making are not true. Here's the evidence that this is all, But the fact of the matter is that the Baha'is, do all of their work under the umbrella of various powerful lobby organizations. So within America and Europe, particularly, the Baha'is are essentially, they have made themselves an extension of the Jewish lobby. And I find this very strange. And I have spoken to many Jews, whether in Europe, in the United States, or even here, as to why they are giving cover to a organization that at least on surface espouses an idea that has nothing to do with Judaism, and I never get a clear answer from that. And several, very interesting characters that I ran into Berlin themselves were, kind of hit a aha moment. What is going on here? Why are we, what do these people have to do with us? But this stuff comes directly from the government of Israel or the various interests associated with this Israeli establishment, who seem to have some kind of agreements with this organization and this presence going back all the way to the period of 1948. One individual wishes to remain anonymous, said the following to me. He said that when the British left and agreed to leave Palestine in 1948, one of the things that they basically demanded of the Zionist leadership in Israel at the time was that the British would agree to leave on one of the conditions being that the Zionist entity and the government of Ben Gurion and future generations after that would accord the Baha'i presence in Palestine perpetual protection. I would love to see any documentation around that if it exists, but this basically says that the Imperial British presence basically bartered and made a deal with the Zionists at that time in the 1940s, that one of the reasons that they would leave was to maintain this group. This has become a very thorny issue to local Israelis and local Jews over there and Arabs alike. In around 2007, you had the publication of a documentary, or what some people may call a mockumentary, by the name of Baha'is in My Backyard, made by these two Israeli filmmakers, Asaf Shafir and Nama Peiritz. Nama Peiritz contacted me. She actually wanted to put me in this mockumentary or documentary. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. We were busy. I was in Australia at the time. They were traveling between Israel, Europe, and the Americas, so it just didn't happen. But we had a series of emails and a couple of phone conversations. And she confessed that the vast majority of average Israelis have no clue about what these people are, why they're here, what they represent, why are they building these gigantic megalomaniacal structures in the heart of Mount Carmel? Why is there a bunker mentality, and why is there all the secrecy? And so when they did an interview, when they conducted their interview with one of the people that ended up in that mockumentary, this gentleman by the name of Frederick Glacier, one of the questions that they asked him very pointedly is that why is this organization enjoying an intimate relationship with governments of the West more so than anybody else, more so with various Jewish, Christian, or Muslim congregation, definitely more than like an organization like even the Chabad, with the Lubavitchers, which seem to be everywhere. We're doing the same thing as well. Why is that? And Frederick Glacier obviously couldn't give a proper answer to this question. I would have if they had asked me and put me on there. And that is because as the original globalists, I would say, this organization has provided tremendous perks to the Western plutocracy and establishment going back to the early 19th century. Because whereas a company or a government or a representative of government has to be very careful and cross their T's and dot their I's whenever they travel between borders and between countries, a religious organization, relatively speaking, unless you're traveling the Muslim world, is allowed. They're not questioned. If you go, for example, to countries in Africa, where the Baha'is have a huge presence, or Southeast Asia, if you are representing yourself as a member of or a representative of a community who believes this, and this, no questions are asked. The suspicion that that would be projected on you if you were a corporation or government wouldn't be there. And this is what they've done. And so, for purposes of espionage, the Baha'is have been the best thing since sliced bread for the global plutocracy and these globalists. Whether we're talking about for information extraction, whether we're talking about the movement of capital and money, they have been, a godsend. This is why they're also then elevated in, these institutions in the West and whatnot. But all in all, they have gotten a free ride. And this is what I don't understand about a lot of the conspiracy community online, is that when they're talking about the Rothschilds, or if they're talking about the Jews, or if they're talking about the Illuminati or the Masons or the secret society, the real enemy that is right in your face is never discussed by these people.
Yeah,
they don't want to know about the Baha'is.
That's the problem, Sheikh, is anytime where actual truth is presented, I actually realized that even myself with my background, that looking into a lot of these conspiracy people and their backgrounds and who they were, a lot of them are actually shills and gatekeepers. They're really not going to talk about.
Yes.
They're not going to talk about the real info. And the name that they're using, let's say, for their personality base, like that's not what their name is. So their identity is, they're not using their real identities, number one. And number two, the things that need to be talked about are not being talked about. Like there's one person who, instead of mentioning what you're talking about, he always puts the blame on Islam or a group called the Roshaniya. And you have to look at the other spectrums of the situation where they want you to look this way while you actually should be looking that way. And see, that's the whole problem with the whole thing. And if you look into all of it, it's basically the same people fighting against the same people. Even if you go back thousands of years ago till the times of Darius of Persia, there were these different cultists within Persia that they were fighting against, different influences from the West and different influences that were trying to infiltrate and destroy Persia. The time of Darius, up until this very point that I'm speaking with you, it's still the same people fighting against the same people under different ideologies and identities. And that's why even those that are going to watch this podcast, part 3 later on, are going to realize why we got attacked in the middle of our conversation and the stream got interrupted.
Yeah. And this is, like I said, this is all business as usual for me. Mm-hmm. This sort of thing has happened so many times in so many different contexts. But, we have a responsibility to push back against this. This is the difference between, people of conscience and people who don't have one, is that people of conscience do something in the face of evil. They don't just sit back and watch it and make excuses about why they're not going to do anything.
Yes.
And this is the sort of thing that I believe that one gets questioned about on the other side, by the true power of the universe. What did you do to push back against the zulm, the injustice, the darkness in your lifetime? Let me see your report card. These are the sorts of things. Now, the fact that we're even having this conversation and that there is an interest in this and that people are recognizing that there is an issue here in itself is my victory. That means that I have managed to finally convince a cross-section of people that this organization and the people associated with it, but not your average rank and file people, but the people associated with it at the top, the mafia is a problem.
Yeah.
that requires further scrutiny. That these people are not what they claim they are. They are not peace and fluff and love and kumbaya as they present themselves as. That there's a lot more going on. And, folks who want details of any of this stuff are always welcome to contact me. And as much as I can, I will give them the lowdown on what is what.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it says that in the Holy Quran in one of the verses that why do you not help each other? So those in the Islamic community, those that are in the Sufi communities, those that are spreading the truth like I am in my channel for the last 2 years, or what Sheikh Wahid Azal is doing for many, many years. And it's not just given its due justice and due credit, but the fruits of his labor as time goes on and the seeds that he's planting will take fruit and they will blossom into these beautiful trees that will give everyone the oxygen of freedom and the oxygen of truth. And this will
Inshallah.
happen. And no one gets away with anything, whether they
No.
gang stalked him or his wife, Roya, rest in peace, or his father. Nobody gets away with anything in this life or the next. That is a testament that I can attest to myself, that those who dig a hole for you, they fall into
Fall
their
into,
own holes.
yeah, they fall into it themselves.
That's
They
exactly
fall into it. It's like, I love that saying. The Germans have a version of it as well, because it's so true. When you dig a hole for somebody else, you could be the most powerful, person on this earth with your pockets, you know, basically busting up with King Solomon's mind. But if you do that, you're going to fall in that hole yourself.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I myself, as a Muslim American, have been gang stalked. I've been put through different forms of spiritual warfare. But then again, this is the life that we chose. Of the life of the Awliya and the prophets, peace be upon them, they suffered much worse than us. And we have to just keep the faith, keep our iman, and do the best that we can, and just not lose your faith in God in whatever which way you perceive that divinity. As the Quran says, that all believers are but one brotherhood from Surah 49. So we must support each other in these endeavors. And again, I would encourage everybody, please watch part 1 that I did with Sheikh, part 2, inshallah, part 3. Hopefully everything goes well with the recording. And I'll continue to put his links in the description and continue to do part 4, 5, so on and so on, to spread his messages of truth that he's trying to share in the honor of his life, that the type of life that he has lived, for his wife, for his daughter, for his father, for his entire family, and the future that he's fighting for, to give his family and basically his own self and the world around him a future that we can all benefit from. Because right now, all I see is chaos all around. There's hatred, division. And what he's saying about these Duganists, they're the ones who are, a lot of them, spreading the anti-vax propaganda here. They're telling
Yes, they are.
people not to get the vaccine, or
Yep.
the government's out to kill you. I got the vaccine. Everyone in my family got the vaccine. We're fine. Nothing happened to us. They're spreading this propaganda about all this stuff about the government. And half of them were following a lot of these cultists that stormed the Capitol on January 6th. So
Yes.
we have to take in account that these people are not to be taken lightly. Putin's Rasputin, whatever he goes by, they are a real menace, and you have to speak out against it. And there are all cultists of the kings of Edom. Like, these people never went away.
100%.
They never went away. They always existed. And these cultists, since the time of Darius, who struggled against them, up until this very point, we have to keep up the struggle, and we have to stand by Sheikh Wahid Azal and
Thank you.
Fatimiyya Sufi order in our endeavors as well, in the past, present, and in the future. So Sheikh, please,
Inshallah.
whatever closing remarks or closing thoughts you have, welcome it.
Yeah, I want to support what you just said about, Dugan and his networks. These people are the representatives of the kingdom of Edom. I mean, he himself even confesses this in so many words at the end of his the fourth revolutionary theory, this appendix of his known as the metaphysics of chaos. He says this outright, blatantly. This was the man that, after the election of Donald Trump, went on Alex Jones and claimed that Donald Trump was the second George Washington. Well, how did that turn out? So much for God. Yeah, and they are. These people are pushing the anti-vax extremely reactionary nonsense, and they are. But what people need to understand, this is not just the Russians. The Russians are a component of it, but I believe that Russia itself, and this should be a future podcast that we do, that
Yes.
Russia itself is nothing more and nothing less than an American or a, not even, we don't have to use the word American, that Russia is a neoliberal corporate satellite, that its oligarchs and its political leadership are not at loggerheads with the West. This is all theater.
Mm.
This 2-3 year theater that we had in the United States about the election of 2016. This is all to entertain people, because where it counts, these people are dealing with each other. And Alexander Dugin has served a segment of the American establishment like nobody else. This re-rolling of fascists in the far right and the alt-right, and this putting more fuel to the fire of white supremacy in the United States at a time where, before all of this, we were slowly inching our way into resolving this thing, bringing things to parity, killing this white demon, as it were. All of a sudden, out of nowhere comes Mr. Dugin and his networks, and then we get Mr. Donald Trump sitting in the White House.
It's funny, Sheikh, because I believe this is very important, that part 4, we talk about the role of Russia and the cults that exist in Russia, and Dugin and his minions in general. Because what's been going on is there's a Sheikh that's very, he's from Trinidad, and he's also very popular currently in Pakistan, unfortunately. And they're listening to him, and he's espousing this Islamic eschatology of the end times, that Russia is going to be the ally of the Muslim world, which I believe is totally contrary, and he's pushing disinformation. So that's why I believe that we owe this to the Muslim world, that
100%.
in the future, and I'm sure you know who I'm talking about.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
So part 4, we have to do against the cultists that are in Russia, which I believe is very important, because they do have an influence. And I remember in 2016, 2017, even my iPhone, somebody was trying to hack it from Russia. But thankfully, I basically tell everybody, always enable 2-factor authentication on all your devices. That's what keeps you safe.
But I will also say this, they're a lot weaker now than they were 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
We'll see where this goes, but this was a good one. I needed to get that out, as it were. So the future will be interesting when we start getting into real meaty stuff like the Russians.
Yes, Sheikh, and that's the beauty. We're building this tree, part 1, 2, 3, 4, and all the way until we get to the top. And I'm grateful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought you into my life, and inshallah, please continue to pray for me, and I will continue to pray for you. And let's just continue on this journey of light. And again, whatever content that I produce with you, you have permission to upload and distribute wherever you wish to do so. And
thank you very much.
For our viewers, please follow Sheikh Wahid Azal. I will put his academia, his Twitter, Facebook, Blogspot, everything in the description below. So thank you all again, and goodbye to all.